Okay, hello and welcome to today's discussion. I'm delighted to be here with Elaine Benfield and Jerry Welsch to talk about the balance between the proactive and the reactive in analyst relations. This is one of the biggest topics, one of the biggest problems that I think people have is maintaining their direction. Before we get into it, I'd just like to introduce Elaine and Jerry. These are two highly experienced giants in the analyst relations community with deep expertise. Elaine is one of the few people to have worked at the vice president level in the analyst relations business during her time at SAP and Ariba. Jerry is one of the most, ingenious and effective AR practitioners I've come across. His work at Asana is doubly interesting for analyst relations people, firstly as an expert practitioner, but secondly, using the Asana project management suite itself to run analyst relations programs, I know from speaking to Jerry is an amazing source of insight. Elaine, Jerry, I want to turn to you one by one and just say, like, who are you? Why are you here? Why is this topic interesting for you? And Elaine, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, you can keep talking about how great we are. But anyway, hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Benfield. I've been in high tech now. I always say I age myself quickly, over 25 years. I started my career at an agency in Boston. I had a public affairs background beforehand, worked in an agency and started working in high tech and fell in love with it, and have been doing marketing strategy, analyst relations, public relations, communications, messaging, everything in all the above. I really fell in love with analyst relations and was one of the first analyst relations people in Boston, and was even written in a newspaper about, hey, there's this new job called analyst relations. And I had to explain what that meant and how you leverage the analyst firms way back in the late 90s. So I'm really aging myself. And I think it's such a wonderful niche of a market that is so critical for a business. And I joke that kind of my last few years, I really went into the influencer marketing, which is kind of the evolution of this analyst space. And, all my years kind of combined. So that's a good kind of snapshot of who I am.
Thank you so much. Jerry, who are you? Let us know all about you.
So I too have been in tech and in the analyst world now for over 25 years. I started in the late 90s as an analyst at Frost & Sullivan, covering aerospace and defense markets. I pivoted in that space into IT related markets in aerospace and defense, where I had the greatest interest. That's where technology was moving the fastest and was most interesting to me. I then moved from that role into a consulting role with IDC, where I was for almost 10 years covering data center infrastructure markets from a consulting perspective, working with the analysts there to develop custom research, custom market models, content, and so forth. And after about 15 years of being on the analyst side, I was always wondering, what's it like on the vendor side? And I took a role with Equinix, leading competitive intelligence there. And after about a year or so, my boss said to me, you spend a lot of time talking to analysts. And I said, well, I get a lot of great, in competitive intelligence, and we have great information exchange. He's like, but there's an opening on the AR team. I feel like talking to analysts so much. Why don't you check that out? So I did, and I never looked back. I started that role. I fell in love with it. I was part of the AR team at Equinix for about four plus years. And then I moved on to a couple other roles in the SaaS world. And today I'm with Asana. I've been there about a year and a half. And I've just loved learning from other people. First, my mentors and team at Equinix, but subsequently just engaging with lots of peers about best practices and trying different things. And that's where I am today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And let me just introduce myself. My name is Duncan Chapple. I'm hosting this discussion. Like Jerry, I was an industry analyst during the dot-com boom at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. And then, like Elaine, I worked through public relations, working in public relations agencies. And then for most of the time since then, I've been either consulting to analyst relations programs or leading analyst relations programs. At the moment, I'm working for Elisa. This is a Finnish telecommunications company, which is doing a roll-up of automation software businesses. And this is super satisfying to be working with a range of brands, introducing them to industry analysts. And definitely this question of proactivity and reactivity is a key question. Because when you've got a portfolio of solutions, as many clients do, you might have more inbound inquiries over your legacy solutions, and you might lose the time and energy, for example, that you need to put behind your strategic growth platforms. I wonder if I think I'd like to start off in two ways. I mean, firstly, just to discuss this thing about the reactive and the proactive, do they add up to a constant? Like if you do more reactive, is there less proactive? And then this feels like something that is much more challenging because of changes in the analyst landscape. And I wonder if either of you would like to pick up on one of those questions, and then maybe the other of you might want to pick up on the other one.
Jerry, you want to go first?
Sure, I can jump in. I think you asked the question if you're doing more reactive, are you doing less proactive? And I think it's not so much what are you doing more or less of, it's where are you applying your proactive efforts versus leaving other efforts to reactive work. And there's been a lot of people who've surmised about how an individual AR person should be only engaging with a certain number of analysts in a proactive way. I mean, you only have so much time and you can only put so much focus. That number varies from maybe up to 10 or even 15, which is a lot of people to manage proactively. But you kind of, there's always this practice of, how do I tier my analysts, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? And if you're able to tier 1, put a tier 1 of a group of analysts of like 10 to 15, that should be an indication to you, those are the ones that you're proactively working with. Those are the most important people, the most influential people in your market, and also in terms of the insight that you can get from them to inform your business. And so that's where most of the proactive effort is. And then you look at the tier 2, tier 3, maybe in tier 2, you might be proactive with briefing and a little bit of inquiry. But you're mostly reacting. And then in tier 3, it's, when they reach out to you, you respond and you support as much as you can. And for me, that's sort of how I see the balance between proactive and reactive.
Yeah, and I would jump on that. I think one of the challenges AR people have, they become reactionary because there's so many reports. We're driven by reports in the market. And oftentimes I've helped mentor a lot of, analyst relations professionals, and they're like, oh no, another magic quadrant, another wave, another report's coming. They didn't get a chance to be proactive. And then you're only getting that analyst to know about you from the report questions. And it's you have to catch up to being proactive, as you said, Jerry, to those target people. Because if you're not getting off to get them caught up on what your story is, what's the messaging, what's the product rollout. Now with the SaaS model of a lot of companies, there's constant updates. How do you have the analysts know what you're doing proactively so you're not in a reaction mode with these reports? Because then you're never going to be looked upon as, market leading, showing all your features, functionality, your company's strategy and everything. So I think it's hard, but years ago, I would always do, some type of something in the spring, something in the fall, and travel. Sometimes now everything's more remote. The world is more, flexible with all, Zoom and everything, but it's really important to make sure what's your cadence for all these reports so that you really do jump ahead so that, analysts know who you are prior to just those reports.
Can I mean, to try to make a difficult question even more challenging, I mean, can I ask both of you to kind of drop to the bottom line on that? Like, for Jerry, it's very important to focus on, to put much more effort into the more important people than into the less important people. And for you, it's, and especially an organization like SAP, where just the volume of inbound inquiry when you're a market leader is so completely different, even from if you're number 3 or number 5 or number 10 in the market. Like having those understanding the outcomes that you want, right? So how do people get there? Because I see there are lots of people who've got, they might have tiers, but actually there may not be like a lot of strategic thinking between the way that they're tiering, right? They're just tiering people because, well, these people, get more hits on Google and the ones lower down get fewer hits on Google. And sometimes there isn't much alignment between the way that people are prioritizing and how business goals change. For example, you see organizations like change business strategy, but the analyst who they're talking to stays the same. So how do you get to the point that you know that the people who you're prioritizing are the right people?
I think, just Jerry, I'll jump in. I think it's one of the hard things of, a company can have a vision of, oh, these are the people and these are who they think are the most beneficial for their business. But in the end, who are your customers talking to? Who are the prospects talking to? I think it's really important to know that audience, because sometimes the boutique firms are more important. They're the ones who talk to the senior level executives. They're the ones that have the ongoing relationship. Sometimes the big firms aren't as close to who you're trying to target. So I think knowing who your audience is, knowing what your products are, and who are the best people to help tell your narrative and be kind of another voice for you, having those reports aligned to what your story is and what your product offering is super critical, because I
Mhm.
think you really do have to look at what is your company's goals, but then sometimes leadership doesn't quite see that, hey, boutique firm really is the right, because there's some firms that have cachet and everyone knows them in the market, but in the end sometimes small medium businesses don't have the money to fund those big firms. They really go to the small firms, and that's okay because that's who they're trying to target anyway. So
Mhm.
it's definitely, you have to really know and be really active on knowing who your target customer is. It's just critical for your analyst relations program.
Jerry, I think what Elaine has touched on there is the way that the analyst landscape is changing. I think it's changing in an obvious way that there are different analyst firms around, different analysts are coming to the fore. Some of the old ones are, Forrester, maybe that's an example of an organization which is struggling to maintain its relevance in the current market. But then also the analyst firms themselves are in transition. And I know that you've just been at Gartner's Global Research Advisory Council, which maybe not only in what IDC is saying, but also in what other attendees are saying there. You've got a sense of how business models are changing and how the importance of the different analyst firms might be realigning and changing.
Yeah, so IDC's Global Research Advisory Council is, a great place to learn about where IDC is going in the coming year, provide and get the opportunity to provide some feedback. They invite me not because we're a huge customer, but because they know me,
Mhm.
and which is fine. But I think what was interesting this year is that usually they make some minor announcements. Oh yeah, this is we're moving in this direction, we're moving that direction. But this year they really there's been some big changes there. There's new leadership at IDG, which is the parent company, and the previous leadership had created this company called Foundry, which encapsulated all the go-to-market activities around what used to be IDG Communications. And now there's a new leadership that's brought both IDC and the Foundry side of the business together under one roof. A CEO, a CFO, a CRO, and a CMO as well. So all the executive leadership is now running the entire business, and IDC is just a part of that. Well, which means that the leadership there is really managing the product and focusing on the research in the product, and it's allowed them to innovate a little bit and look to expand their total addressable market beyond your traditional product managers, product marketers that typically work with IDC, and maybe some executive leadership too, but they're coming out with new offerings for end users. And this is something that I've been talking with IDC about for the past 10 years since I left. That there's a lot of opportunity to challenge the incumbents who focus on advising end users. And so they're coming to market with a product that's very data driven, which is IDC's strength, to address the opportunity to help customers make purchase decisions, or at least vendor selection decisions, above and beyond the marketscapes in a way that's very data driven and very obviously data driven. So they have this new product that's coming to market. They're going to start with the software space, addressing that. And then they are also coming to market with a new product addressing sales teams, and looking at all the data, the intelligence that they have to help sales teams do account planning. And so again, they're expanding their total addressable market, not only to end users, but also to sales teams, which traditionally they haven't sold into. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there that that I think is worth checking out, and seeing how IDC can be more influential with the buyer, and more influential with helping sell. So that's one opportunity. And just to add what Elaine was talking about in terms of, and I'm sorry, but the original question was more around, the focus on how to determine which analysts are your tier one. I think the other side of it is going back to your internal stakeholders, your subject matter experts that are engaging with the analysts, that you're introducing to the analysts, and learning from them whether or not they're getting value out of those interactions. And if they're not getting value out of interactions with a certain analyst, then maybe they're not important. And so you have to balance not only who are these people influencing externally in terms of the buyer, but how are they influencing your internal stakeholders, and what kind of impact are they having internally on your business? And the bigger the impact that they have, I think the more important they are, the more they're going to be listened to, and you should nurture those relationships.
And they change over time. I think, Jerry, what you said is they get their own mission, the analysts, of like, hey, this is what you have to do. Sometimes the report shifts, sometimes their knowledge shifts, sometimes who they cover. It's okay that you could have had a great relationship with someone, and just timing over time, they might not be as relevant. And you have to be, part of the strategic AR program is make sure you shift. If they're not the right people anymore,
Yep.
saying that you don't want a relationship with them, but you might want to find others that are more relevant. It's just, sometimes it changes, so.
But Elaine, Jerry's point about
it's the same
internal,
thing.
Well, let me just say, like, Jerry's point about internal stakeholders is really interesting, because on the one hand, it can be really useful and important to listen to your internal stakeholders, because that inbound value of the analysts is so crucial. On the other hand, internal stakeholders may have, mistaken or superficial ideas of which analysts are really influential on their clients and on their target markets. Yeah? And one of the challenges that we have is like the rise of new influencers, some of whom are using like really creative channels, but others are like really open for business, and they're fundamentally using the vendors' channels. They're being amplified by the vendors who are paying for them. And so does listening to stakeholders also make it a little bit harder to be more proactive and less reactive, when it can be so hard to differentiate thought leaders from influencers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the hardest things. And most organizations have multiple levels of executives. Products have their own level of executives, and then you have the corporate strategy versus the product, and then you've got product people versus there's constantly your stakeholders. Sometimes you're dealing with multiple. I had most of my career, there could be 50 stakeholders, if not, I mean, I'm not exaggerating, could be even more. Everyone kind of had their own image, and how they want to leverage the analysts. And I think it's critical to know who in the end is the top of it, who is the one that makes them, because you have to play it's so critical for the strategy of a company, but then the products are critical. So you kind of have to balance it out. It's one of the hardest, most challenging of, and some product executives and some executives are better with analysts, period. I used to have you're assigned to this analyst because you understand analyst relations. And then you pull some executives that are great with customers, but they're not great with analysts. And you have to have who is the right person to be the interface with the company, between the company and the analyst. So I think it's knowing who your stakeholders are, and there just could be multiple, and you have to figure out a way to kind of appease everyone, which is always the juggling act. But I think it's super critical.
And Jerry, what are your thoughts about, about, on the one hand, using, using the sentiment of internal stakeholders to evaluate how important analysts are. There are also tools like, AR Insights Power 100, for example. Where can analyst relations teams find that true north, to understand where they should be navigating towards?
Yeah, I think so. If I can backtrack just a little bit and talk about when I do a training with internal stakeholders before their initial engagements with analysts, just to give them a sense of, who they are and how they differentiate and how to work with them and get positive outcomes. And one of the things I talk about is, the relative roles of subject matter experts within the organization versus analyst relations. One of the things I talk about is that analyst relations has a broad set of relationships with a large set of analysts. And what you're going to have as a subject matter expert is probably just some deeper relationships with a few analysts that you're going to engage with on a regular basis. You're going to build trust with. They're going to build trust with you, and you're going to have your own relationships with analysts. It's not just analyst relations. It's analyst relations becomes a fostering of creating relationships for subject matter experts, so that they can get win-win relationships with the analysts. They get lots of insight. The analysts get insight from them, and so forth. And I think that's really important to think about. Okay, I've got this stakeholder who's really good with analysts, and with these 2 or 3 analysts, they really connect. And so the proactive part there becomes, okay, I want to foster that relationship more and more and make sure that there's regular contact between them to continue that conversation and learn more. And as you said, Elaine, sometimes, where the company is going is diverging from where the analyst interest is. And sometimes you have to, sort of wean that relationship away. But there's also the opportunity, in my experience, since I've moved, this is my 4th company now, in working in analyst relations in the past 8-9 years. There are some analysts that you foster relationships with in a previous company where you no longer work with them anymore when you go to another company in a different category. But sometimes things come around, and I just yesterday had an inquiry with an analyst that I hadn't talked to in about 3 or 4 years, because the topic that they cover now, and they had switched, is very relevant to my company today. And so it's great to come back to those people and have those conversations, and then see how you can bring them or their team back in to engage and learn more.
And that's the pleasure of being in the market so long, that the people that we work with 25 years ago, odds are they're going to come back around, that those relationships and those fundamental, people come. It's funny because I'm always like, oh, you're in my space again. It's like, oh, I haven't talked to you in, as you said, a few years. And it's funny that, we are still a niche market, and there's only so many analysts in the market. So it is funny. It does really come around, and those relationships are key.
I wonder if I can try to move on a little bit to, like, what is holding people in this reactive state? And Jerry, I know you also make I think a very convincing point that we think about AR teams that are completely reactive as being the worst around, but of course there is something even worse, which is just being engaged in that spray and pray broadcast mode, where you're not even listening, not even reacting. But I think that is maybe more the characteristic of analyst relations programs run by people who do not have too much analyst relations expertise. Whereas I think sometimes it's exactly because analyst relations people want to be helpful that they end up, responding to the squeaky wheels and trying to be helpful to the people who are asking for help, and then maybe neglecting other people who are more significant, but who are not so proactive in requesting information from providers. Where does this reactivity come from, and how can you spot if you are more reactive than you should be?
I think when it comes to reactivity, especially when I mentioned that spray and pray, and I that's not my expression. I have to give that to somebody I worked with a number of years ago who talked about what things were like before there was an AR program here, so to speak, more formal, full-time AR program. And that was, mostly what when companies get started in working with analysts, they're just trying to brief everybody. And they really don't take advantage of, the paid relationship, which really gives you access to inquiry. I had a CEO at a previous company who just was so convinced that working with analysts was all about, pay and play, right? And really what it comes down to is what you're paying for is access. And whether or not you get your return on your investment is how you use that access, right? Through inquiry, through advisory, and so forth. And so when it comes to being reactive or proactive, you can look at your at the balance of inquiry versus briefings. Just take those two basic types of engagements with analysts. I like to think that a successful program is one that is you have a balance of about 4 inquiry for every briefing, right? Because that's where the value really comes in the conversation with the analysts. Yes, you have to educate them in order to have informed conversations with them. But the more conversations you have, the more you're going to get out of your interactions. And so if you're doing a ton of briefing, I would think briefing is a more reactive mode, whereas inquiry is a much more proactive mode. And if you're doing more briefing than inquiry, you're being more proactive. I mean, more reactive, if you will, rather than proactive. And that would be a glaring indication that you're being more reactive than proactive if you're doing more briefing than inquiry.
And I think that's a great point, Jerry, because I think, Duncan, you touched on something. I think the market's shifting, that some companies are hiring people that don't have AR backgrounds, that think, oh, well, their communications and their PR, and oh, they can do that because they can do relationships, or they ran customer programs and they can do analyst relations. You have to understand, as you said, Jerry, I think it's super important to understand inquiries are a two-way street. You're asking a question to get feedback. Briefings are really supposed to be more one-sided. Some analysts will engage with you, but in the end, they're here to listen. They're not there to give feedback. And I think what I've seen in the market shifting, we're starting to get some of the new entry-level AR people don't understand the fundamentals. No offense, but we've been doing this so long to know how to leverage those contracts and those relationships. And I think if you're hiring someone, what I've seen is a lot of the newer AR people really are reactionary because they don't know. They don't know how to leverage some of those relationships and honestly, all the functions you have and all the features within a contract. So I do think we've all been doing this long enough to go, oh, okay, this is the way it should be. That's a great 4-to-1, is a great ratio. I completely agree. But I think the newer AR people need to get some of their sea legs to go, oh, these are all the ways you can interact. And I think they're naturally go toward reaction and reactionary versus proactive. It's just not, because it's more safe. People coming to ask you questions is a little, they're coming at you versus, building those relationships, being more proactive. That's what I've seen.
And sometimes you do need, oh, sorry, Duncan. I was just going to say, sometimes you do need
your turn.
Yeah. When you're just getting started, right? To get to know analysts, you've got to brief them, right? And hear the kind of questions they're asking. Are they asking questions that indicate that they're really interested in learning more and having more conversation? And then those are the ones you go back to with inquiry, not necessarily with subject matter experts, but just one-on-one to learn a little bit more about where their interests truly lie and whether or not there's somebody you really want to engage with. That's sort of, I've made shifts from company to company where I'm going from one category to another, and I've got to learn and meet a whole new set of analysts. And in that first 2 to 3 months, you're sitting in on briefings that your team needs to do, but then you're also following up with a lot of inquiry one-on-one to get to know these people and to learn really how their interests align with those of your company as you're learning more about your company as well. I think that's really, really important.
And I think even as you're starting with the company, sometimes just doing inquiries to find out, what do the analysts think of you? What are the what challenges have you had? I was notorious for always doing analyst audits. I always want to know what the analysts think. Like, hey, I'm new in this role. Talk to me. Everything's on the table. And getting that information, I always I had executives like, you're doing all the briefings and you're talking and doing the inquiries. I'm like, inquiries to me are critical for this role, to have those one-on-ones for like, there's no one else but us. Just tell me how I help you. Because in the end, it's that give and take. I think it's just critical. So
Yeah.
it's really important.
And I'll add to that, especially this time of year. This is when you do inquiry with analysts one-on-one to really learn what are they thinking about for next year, right? Where are they going to be focused? What reports or research are they thinking about?
Jerry, I wonder if I can just pick up on a point that you made and throw that back to Elaine. Elaine, what Jerry paints absolutely is like a relationship orientation. And would it be kind of cruel to say that there's also like the opposite of that, which is a very transactional coverage and report orientation? Like from my point of view, listening to Jerry, it kind of sounds like it's better to be speaking to analysts now when they're doing their planning, when they're thinking expansively, almost better to speak to analysts in the off season than in the on season when they are heads down and working on their magic quadrants and their Forrester waves and so on. But I think so many people are only engaging with analysts when they are working on highly relevant research, because that flows from the forward features table that colleagues on the media relations side know so well, where you want to hit people when you've got something relevant to say for what they're doing tomorrow. But then that absolutely, I don't know, that feels like that's a totally different paradigm for AR.
Yeah.
And it's a deeply reactive one, isn't it? Because you're just being led by your calendar, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that Jerry said something like, to me, I'm that planner. I want to know what I'm doing next year. I'm already doing budgets. Most companies are, if you're in a fiscal calendar year, you're doing budget planning August and September. So you need to know what money you have for AR months in advance. But then if you talk to the analysts, like Jerry said, in kind of this type of, November, December, October, November, December, you're really knowing what's coming and getting that, so that can help you then go, where do I allocate, spending briefing money? What are you going to do at the strategy day? Where are you? And that's always, to me, super critical. I always feel like fall is such a planning mode. There's so many reports in the spring. There's tons of reports in the fall, but I want to be ahead of it. I used to have like a mapped calendar going, here's what I'm hearing all year. Yes, it pivoted and it changed, but I still knew, just so you know, I always, my marketing arm knew, the PR arm knew, we always knew kind of that rollout, because I want everyone to know, hey, just so you know, this is critical, this is what's coming. And I loved planning, knowing, anticipating what's happening. And the way to do that is really through the inquiries and those relationships, because they're going to be honest and tell you what they're working on.
I feel like we've kind of covered a lot of the ground of how to know whether you're more like a reactive or a proactive program. And I wonder if it might be good in the 15 minutes or so that we have left just to roll forward a little bit to talk about the root causes of AR challenges, and then what strategy should people be testing to see if they've got this balance right. So if I think about like the root causes of AR challenges, I mean, Jerry, I think you've hinted, both of you, I think, have hinted a lot on the way that like a lack of alignment, just having too many things in your inbox and you don't know how to prioritize them, and obviously, Elaine, you've alluded to like the changing reality of influence. How can people understand where their reactivity might be coming from, and what are the pressures either in the relationships with stakeholders or the relationships with analysts that could help them to better understand how they can get more control over things?
I'll jump in. I think, at least for me, and I have a unique situation being within Asana, where Asana is a work management platform where I can actually tie all the work that I do to a set of goals that we come up with, on an annual basis. And if I find that I'm doing some work that isn't tied to one of those goals, I know that that work is irrelevant for my organization and therefore for me. So if you can find a way to organize the work that you do as part of an AR program and tie that work to your goals and track whether or not the work that you're doing is actually helping you achieve those goals, then you can understand what's the relevant work and what's not.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, as you were saying it, what does the company want? What is your goal? Because are you trying to get customers? Well, that's one area. Then you need to track how are the analysts coming into the sales cycle to be relevant. And we used to do that years ago. Salesforce is a great tool that every salesperson couldn't put in the customer. They couldn't go through once they put in a customer, they had to put how that customer came in the sales cycle. And an analyst was a checkbox. They couldn't move forward without saying if there was a third party involved. Tracking it to that level from a customer standpoint is great. But what if you really want to get awareness? Well, that's a whole nother way to do the metrics. How are they engaged, in the market to help amplify your company's story? So as we talked about, I think it's just critical to know, what are the goals? What are your goals and metrics? I think we've talked in the past, Duncan, I think it's really hard. Sometimes goals shift mid-year. That's a hard thing for the analyst. Jerry, you understand, it's like, oh, we're running this way. And it's like, no, we're now going this way. To have a really good AR strategic program, you really need to put a stake in the ground going, okay, we're going to try this for a year. Maybe we pivot some, but you have to be running. You can't shift mid-year and all of a sudden your metrics you need time to get those metrics to be relevant and to be understood. So I think that's some of the challenges with companies. They pivot a little too much. And it's like any communications program, you need a little bit of lead time, and same with marketing leads. So I think it's really important to have those goals. And if they shift, try to make sure it doesn't shift too much, because then you can't track well for how the results were from an analyst program.
Or you make changes to your goals, and you have to have executive understanding that you're shifting your goals. My goals are going to shift too. And I'll tell you how I did in the first half of the year, and the second half of the year, we're going to measure something else because we've shifted as an organization. And you're not going to see a full year of results, but you'll see the results as it aligns to, where the company's heading and when.
Exactly.
And I think there are two connected parts of that. One is, do you have the measurements that are relevant for the goals that you have? Like there are so many programs that have very similar measurement techniques, even if their goals are completely different. It's like you're measuring, how close you are to Chicago by how much petrol you're burning, rather than by looking at your location on the map, because it's much cheaper because you've got a petrol gauge in front of you and you don't have a locationometer or whatever, right? But then the other part of that, as Jerry has hinted, is that if the goals change, being able to concretize the change in the goals, having consequences for the changes in the measurement, and then going back to your stakeholders and saying, look, if you want this, then this means I'm going to start measuring that, and it means I'm going to stop prioritizing not that. And that is also a big tool, isn't it, in dealing with reactivity, because very often the firefighting that AR people are engaged in is when they come in and they say, our competitor was mentioned in this report from Markets and Markets, why are we not doing so well in it? And then your role is to say, well, maybe that's the most significant firm in the world for us. Maybe that's a completely trivial firm for us, but let's focus on our goals, not on one individual opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, you go ahead, Jerry.
No, go ahead, Elaine, please.
No, so I definitely agree with you. And I think it's really important to know, when you have multiple products, you could have multiple AR people. And I think it's also their measurement by product and what their goals are could shift by product to product to product. And I think it's important to have that seamless, what's a goal everyone on the team has that is consistent. You need to have one or two goals that is for the, and then you have to be very laser focused on, for a product that could be different. They're not always going to match because you have different divisions that have different goals and priorities. So I think that's, having that, you can't forget the different teams and how everyone aligns. But in the end, what's the one funnel that goes up to the top that's a corporate goal. Because I think that's really important too, because we're all in this in tech. There's products, but it's also what's the corporate overall messaging, I think is really important. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I think Jerry, you can jump in too.
So I think one of the things that and just to, if you want to repeat the question one more time, Duncan, just to bring me back, because I was listening to Elaine and I totally get what she's saying.
Oh, good question. I mean, I think the question was something along the, I can't even remember. Oh, how embarrassing is that? Elaine, what was the question?
Well, that's what I was like. I was answering for the just targeting with goals. Like, how do you do it? And I just brought in the product because I think it's really.
Yeah. So Jerry, let me pose that question to you, sure. and then we can edit out this embarrassing thing. So Jerry, let me just flip this back to you. I think Elaine has spoken a lot about the importance of goals, but firstly, where does that fit in terms of getting buy-in and using goals to clarify with internal stakeholders what the directions are? And then what comes next from goals? How do people translate goals into strategies and measurement frameworks? And how do people turn these corporate goals into doing something different from what they would have done if the goals were different?
So let's start with the measurement of goals and how you measure success and things like that. I think one of the really hard lessons I've learned in AR is sometimes you have a goal and you know the perfect measure for that goal. But the question is, can you actually do that measure? Can you execute it with the information and data that the organization has? And what I found a lot of times is that information is just not available, right? The organization doesn't have it, doesn't have the capability to surface it or what have you, or they're just not mature enough or have the the capacity to be able to help you measure that. And so what you really need to do is to say, what is the data, what is the information I do have that can help me measure the goals that I'm laying out for myself and for my team, and how that aligns with the bigger goals of the organization. And so it's really just coming to accept that how you measure goals is dependent upon the information that's available in order to measure them. But you can't necessarily say, I'm not going to state the goal this way because I don't know how to measure it. Mm-hmm. If that's an important goal, you have to put it out there and you have to try to find a way to measure it, but you can't try to reinvent the wheel about what information is available to measure it. And so you have to come to agreement with your management team, your executive team, who wants to know how you're going to measure the success of those goals, to understand and say, look, maybe the measures for this goal are going to be more anecdotal than actually quantitative. And because we just don't have the quantitative data available to measure it, but the goal is still very important. So we have to come to agreement that there's going to be some anecdotal or qualitative measures that are going to help us understand whether or not we've achieved this goal. And that's just sometimes the way you have to do it. But making sure that your goals are aligned with the rest of the company is very important, similar to going out and understanding whether or not your company's interests are aligned with the research interests of analysts. This is also a time of year to have those one-on-ones with executives from various teams to understand what they're thinking about in terms of their goals for the coming year, and how AR can better align with those goals and deliver the types of needs and services that AR delivers to them, to help and support their goals overall, so that there's good alignment between yours and theirs.
And I think also, just jumping in on that, I think it's important. You said something earlier, Jerry, of like, you need to educate your stakeholders. I was aligned with my stakeholders always, no matter what company I've worked at over my 25 years. I presented to them to say, here are what my goals are. Here's my strategy. This is what we're doing. And I was honest. I was like, we're struggling here. We're not struggling here. We need to do this. And throughout the year, I would have, multiple meetings with different stakeholders to educate them on the market. I never wanted anyone to be surprised, but I also needed them to know, as we talked about, like here are the goals. This is what I was told from everyone. I'm listening, but then you can adapt your goals to whatever the changes are with the strategy. but also really helping them understand what you're doing behind the scenes. I think sometimes analyst programs are kind of, no one knows what you're doing behind the scenes, and there's so much work involved. And I think the more you're proactive with your stakeholders, being like, hey, this is what we're doing, and here's what the results are that we're seeing, and just keep them involved. No one's going to be caught off guard if you have a great report or a bad report, or they're always involved. And I think that's really important. The worst thing I'm sure we've all had is that executive yelling at you going, how'd you not know that blah, blah, blah was happening and our competitors are better? It happens. But the more you're proactive to let them know, hey, I'm concerned, we have some challenges coming up, the less, of the blowback could potentially be. So I think that's really important too.
Fantastic. Elaine, Jerry, we are up on our time boundary. I want to thank you so much for what you've said. I think you've given an extremely thoughtful outline, not just about some specific, tactics that analyst relations professionals can use to be more proactive, but you've really pointed towards the key challenge, which is getting the buy-in from internal stakeholders, which obviously requires educating these internal stakeholders on the value of coupling up proactive outreach versus a really thoughtful approach towards listening to analysts and better understanding analysts, building relationships with analysts, and then understanding that the metrics that you're using either have to support it, or as Jerry says, you need to find anecdotal, qualitative proxies to ascertain whether you are moving forwards or not just whether you're doing the activity, but whether you're moving forward with the goals that you want to generate from the analysts who are the most important. Obviously, this is an ongoing conversation about how AR programs are evolving, because I do think that this problem of proactivity and reactivity is much more profound now because of the more complex market that we're in, the more complex forms of influence that we're facing, and the accelerating change in the way that analysts are developing their own business models. Elaine, Jerry, I'm going to give each of you like a minute or something, if the case there's anything you want to summarize, any key thoughts or ideas, and then I'll wrap our webinar up. Thank you.
Jerry, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just go quick. And if there's a way that you can find a tool that helps you manage all your work, and you can tie that work to your goals and the goals of other parts of the organization, I'm lucky. I'm working in a company that provides me that tool that everybody in the company is also working in, and so all the information I need is in one place. And if you can find something similar, try to advocate for something like that that'll help the rest of your organization understand what AR is doing and how AR can support and align better with everybody else's work.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's Jerry. I couldn't agree more. I would also say, analyst relations is a little bit still of a niche market. If you work solo in a company, reach out to others in the industry, bounce ideas off with people, learn the best practices. I think the reason why, I can say I've had a great career in this market is I've had great teams, I've great colleagues, great mentees, and mentors. It's so important. Leverage them in the market. You have questions of, hey, what would you do best practices? All of us would open up the door for anyone to answer questions. It's not a closed community, more or less. And ask if you're not sure and you don't know how to be more proactive. Ask your community, reach out to people on LinkedIn and your support system. I think people would really help you kind of get a better AR program. Don't be afraid to ask if you're not sure.
Elaine, Jerry, this is so inspiring and really helpful. And so many people are struggling with this, and especially as folks get close to the end of the calendar year. I know a lot of people are dealing with just that explosion of activity that happens every October, but then also all the to-do lists from their annual plans. So this is very valuable guidance for them. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll look forward to speaking to you both soon.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.